What do werewolves, bats, blood, Ireland, Saruman, Oscar Wilde, Robert Pattinson, Transylvania, and Frankenstein all have in common? The 1897 Gothic horror novel Dracula, written by Irish author Bram Stoker. He was born on November 8, 1847 in Dublin, Ireland, and died on April 20th, 1912 in London, England at the age of 64, according to his death certificate due to locomotor ataxia. But where did Bram Stoker get his inspiration for this beloved horror icon? Many believe his main inspiration comes from Vlad the Impaler, for many reasons, but primarily because one of Vlad's names was Dracula. Vlad had this name because his father, Vlad II, was given the surname Dracul, which means dragon in Romanian, after joining the Order of the Dragon. Dracula is the Slavonic genitive form of Dracul, meaning the son of Dracul or the dragon. So it really has nothing to do with vampires or the undead. Stoker actually believed Dracula just meant devil in Romanian. David Skal, who wrote the book Something in the Blood, the untold story of Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula, stated in the book, the name Dracula was not well known outside of Romania, but Stoker would make it world famous as the historical source and embodiment of the vampire mythos. In reality, Vlad's connection to Stoker's character was more fortuitous than inspirational, and the author's research was surprisingly thin, but over time, and especially with the release of Francis Ford Coppola's misleadingly titled 1992 film Bram Stoker's Dracula, Vlad's story is now universally misunderstood as Stoker's central source of impetus, and the novel itself is an overheated romance about Dracula's quest over the centuries for the reincarnation of his long-lost love. The motif appears nowhere in Stoker's book, or his foundational notes. So, like a lot of modern-day writers, myself included, he just went with what sounded like a cool name. But what about Countess Elizabeth Báthory? Some believe she, not Vlad, was the real inspiration for Stoker's bloodthirsty count. Why is that? Well, Báthory, born August 7th, 1560, was a Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial killer. She and four of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of girls and women from 1590 to 1610. She and her servants were put on trial and convicted. The servants were executed, whereas Báthory was imprisoned within a castle until her death in 1614. The charges leveled against Báthory have been described by several historians as a witch hunt. Others have said that the accusations against Báthory were supported by testimony from more than 300 individuals, some of whom described physical evidence and the presence of mutilated, dead, dying, and imprisoned girls found at the time of her arrest. Recent sources claim that the accusations were a spectacle to destroy her family's influence in the region, which was considered a threat to the political interests of her neighbors, including the Habsburg Empire. Stories about Báthory quickly became part of national folklore. Legends describing her vampiric tendencies, such as the tale that she bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth, were based on rumors and only recorded as supposedly factual over a century after her death. Although these stories were repeated by at least 3 historians in the 18th and 19th centuries, they are considered unreliable by modern historians. Although Vlad the Impaler and Countess Elizabeth Báthory seem like the most likely of candidates in inspiring Count Dracula, neither figure is ever mentioned in Stoker's plethora of notes. So, if it was neither of these historical figures, then what was it? Well, Stoker worked on the novel for about 7 years, producing over 100 pages of notes for it, drawing extensively from Transylvanian folklore and history. Stoker was a member of the London Library, and they have 25 of the actual books he used as reference material. Many have notes in the margin in his handwriting, plus dog-eared pages for finding relevant passages. And one of his main sources was a book on Transylvania called The Land Beyond the Forest by Scottish writer Emily Gerard. Gerard's The Land Beyond the Forest is credited with introducing Stoker to the concept of nosferatu, a vampire-like creature who sucks the blood of innocent victims. She wrote the book after spending 2 years in the mid-1880s in Romania with her husband, who was posted there as an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. The Land Beyond the Forest was one book that Stoker actually owned rather than having to borrow from the library. Bram Stoker's son actually gifted his father's copy of Gerard's book to the London Library in 1935. In the book, Gerard wrote, "More decidedly evil is the nosferatu, or vampire, in which every Romanian peasant believes as firmly as he does in heaven or hell. Every person killed by a nosferatu becomes likewise a vampire after death, and will continue to suck the blood of other innocent persons till the spirit has been exorcised by opening the grave of a suspected person and either driving a stake through the corpse, or in very obstinate cases of vampirism, it is recommended to cut off the head and replace it in the coffin with the mouth filled with garlic. Another book Stoker used allowed him to adapt the basics of vampirism. In this book, Stoker found actual methods of vampire disposal that were used on suspected corpses: a sharp stake through the heart, decapitation, and cremation. Other methods included the removal of the heart rather than its staking. These were all physical measures taken against a physical threat. For the most part, Stoker intended his vampires to be reanimated corpses, not, as some traditions held, an astral projection of the vampire, which in its nocturnal wanderings collected blood that was somehow dematerialized and physically reconstituted in the grave-bound corpse. The 1888 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica presented this view, but Stoker went his own way. He had the vampires keep the power of dematerialization, but didn't worry about them transporting the blood. He gave Dracula the ability to shapeshift into a bat, a trait not found in folktales, but the additional ability to assume the form of a wolf, something he found in Sabine Baring-Gould's The Book of Werewolves. Baring-Gould described the Serbian Vlakslak, a vampire-werewolf hybrid, and related the Greek belief that werewolves become vampires after death. Stoker liked the descriptions of werewolves so much that he incorporated them almost verbatim into his description of Dracula. Baring-Gould, for instance, says the werewolf's hands are broad and his fingers short, and there are always some hairs in the hollow of his hand. Dracula's hands are rather coarse, broad with squat fingers. Strange to say, there were hairs in the center of the palm. Baring-Gould also gave Stoker descriptions of werewolf eyebrows meeting above the nose and sharp white teeth protruding over the lips. Sound familiar? Since so many film adaptations of Dracula have sunlight as his weakness, incinerating and killing him, readers of Stoker's novel are often surprised that the Count walks the streets of London by day unscathed, although his powers are diminished in the light. In folklore, the vampire, like other evil spirits, retreats into hiding by day but is never destroyed by the sun. Stoker once told an interviewer that he had always been interested in the vampire legend because it touches both on mystery and fact. He went on to explain poorly understood natural phenomena. A person may have fallen into a death-like trance and been buried before the time. Afterwards, the body may have been dug up and found alive, and from this a horror seized upon the people, and in their ignorance they imagined that a vampire was about. Those prone to hysteria through excessive fear might themselves fall into trances in the same way, and so the story grew that one vampire might enslave many others and make them like himself. Okay, so now that we know where his monster came from, what about the setting? Like the Count, his castle and the surrounding area was an amalgamation of multiple places, the main one being a ruined castle in Cruden Bay, Scotland. Stoker went to Cruden Bay in Scotland often between 1892 and 1910. His month-long visits to the Aberdeenshire coastal village allowed him to write a lot. Two of his novels were set in Cruden Bay: The Water's Mow, published in 1895, and The Mystery of the Sea, published in 1902. Stoker started writing Dracula there in 1895 while staying at a hotel. The guest book with his signatures from 1894 and 1895 still survives. The nearby Slains Castle is linked with Bram Stoker, and it is thought to have greatly influenced the descriptions of Castle Dracula. A distinctive room in Slains Castle, the Octagonal Hall, matches the description of the Octagonal Room in Castle Dracula. Stoker also visited the English coastal town of Whitby in 1890, where he stayed at a guest house in Westcliff at 6 Royal Crescent. He did research at the public library at 7 Pier Road, now Quayside Fish and Chips. In the novel, Count Dracula comes ashore at Whitby and, in the shape of a black dog, runs up the 199 steps to the graveyard of St. Mary's Church in the shadow of the Whitby Abbey ruins. And this is only a small sampling of research Stoker did for the novel. He spent 7 years writing hundreds of pages of notes to get the authenticity and story just right. If you want to know more about him and his research, pick up the biography already mentioned, Something in the Blood, The Untold Story of Bram Stoker, The Man Who Wrote Dracula, by David J. Skal. If you're wondering at the beginning why I connected Dracula to werewolves, bats, blood, Ireland, Saruman, Oscar Wilde, Robert Pattinson, Transylvania, and Frankenstein, allow me to explain. I believe I already covered the connection to werewolves, bats, blood, Ireland, and Transylvania, but the others can be explained just as quickly. Saruman, from The Lord of the Rings, was played by Christopher Lee, who also played Dracula in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Robert Pattinson played a vampire in Twilight. Oscar Wilde was in love with the woman who became Bram Stoker's wife. And Frankenstein has often been linked to Dracula through the Universal Studios monster movies and other interpretations. Dracula is one of the most famous pieces of English literature. Many of the book's characters have entered popular culture as archetypal versions of their characters. For example, Count Dracula as a quintessential vampire, and Van Helsing as an iconic vampire hunter. The novel, which is in the public domain, has been adapted for film over 30 times, and its characters have made numerous appearances in virtually all media. How were you introduced to Dracula? Stoker's novel? Movies? TV? Halloween costumes or decorations? Count Chocula? Let me know in the comments, and let me know what other horror movies or books you'd like to know the story behind their story.